Okay, guys, so I'm going to talk you through the language features of the Dagger soliloquy, which is one of the most famous passages in Macbeth, at the end of Act 2, Scene 1. Now, this is really the central purpose of this is to show us that internal turmoil, that inner conflict that Macbeth is going through, and the way in which he has to distance himself from his own actions and his own plotting and his own sense of evil, because he is traumatized by the thoughts of what he is about to do. So his opening line is this a dagger which I see before me, the handle towards my hand? First of all, the phrase I see before me is ambiguous, because we could be talking here about, is it before me in terms of physical space, or is it before me? Is it my destiny in time? So is it right here in front of my eyes, or is it before me in terms of, is it in my future? Is it determining my fate? So again, you see that sense of uncertainty about whether he's looking at something physical that's in front of him, or whether that is coming from his thoughts about being controlled by the supernatural and by the witches. Is his fate being controlled by someone else or something else? The handle towards my hand obviously makes it sound like the dagger itself is being sort of guided towards him. It's tilted towards him as if it's tempting him. Or is it fate itself? Is it fate itself that's tilted towards him? Then he says, come, let me clutch thee. And there's two ways of reading this as well. It could be talking about it, give me physical proof, let me get my hands on it, let me clutch thee. And that then could be him, a sign of weakness, that he sees himself as hallucinating, that the vision is not real and it's a product of his guilt. Or it could be him calling for bravery, let me clutch thee, let me get my hands on this dagger so I can get used to the violence that I'm going to have to inflict. I have thee not, and yet I see thee still. And so it blurs or mixes the present unreality of this hallucination with his future longing. So we've got this sense of not having the dagger and yet still seeing it. So he doesn't have his hands on this weapon that he's going to use to commit regicide, to kill Duncan. And yet he sees it there. And so it both seems distant and close at the same time. Distant because he can't bear to think about the nature of what he's about to do, and yet close because he seems to want to carry out this action. He then says, art thou not fatal vision? And the idea that he calls the dagger a fatal vision gives us this sense that the vision itself predicts his fate. It forecasts what's going to happen to him. It's a vision of the future. But then also that it's given him a sense of his violent destiny. It's a vision that in the end is going to cause his downfall and his death. And so it's fatal in the sense of both temptation and his violent downfall. He then says, art thou not sensible to feeling as to sight? Is the dagger itself likely to be able to be touched? Can I get hold of it in the same way that I can see it? So we could look at this as if he's talking about whether it can be touched. Or it could be as if the dagger itself is sensible. It has some emotional qualities itself and responds to his feelings. So it responds to his own feelings of anxiety or worry about, transmitting this sense of fear that he has at this moment. But then he says, or art thou but a dagger of the mind? Are you just imagined and a hallucination. But it could also be, a dagger of the mind, something that is going to wound the brain. There's a suggestion there of his future psychological damage caused by this. He then calls it a false creation proceeding from the heat-oppressed brain. And this gives us a sense of his extreme mental anguish, that he describes his brain as being heat-oppressed, as if it's sort of overcooking, overheating with all the worry that he has. I see the yet in form as palpable as this which now I draw. So he can see this dagger almost as palpable as if he can get his hands on it as much as the one that he pulls out from his own belt. And then this phrase is important. Thou marshalst me the way that I was going. Marshalling is to lead or to drive him on in the direction that he was going. Firstly, the dagger then seems to be coaxing him and tempting him and driving him towards this action of killing the king. But secondly, he is already going this way, the way that I was going. And so this is a really interesting part of the art, of the soliloquy to focus on in terms of Macbeth's free will. Is he convincing himself that the supernatural is driving him on to an action that he wants to commit anyway? He then says, in such an instrument I was to use. Then he says, mine eyes are made the fools of the other senses, or else worth all the rest. So he either says here, his vision is tricked. My eyes are the fools of all the other senses. They're the rubbish ones. They're the idiots. Or they're worth all of the rest of them combined. It's a visionary, almost hallucination that he's having, that it's powerful and it's allowing him to see into his destiny and his future. His uncertainty there is extremely clear. I see thee still, in spite of all these doubts, and on thy blade and dudgeon is a handle of the dagger, gouts, which are splashes of blood, which was not so before. So in this passage here, his vision of the horrific violence reveals his deep anxiety about his regicidal plan. He can see the dagger gradually becoming splashed with blood, and so it seems to be warning him about what the dagger will be used for. There's no such thing. It is the bloody business which informs thus to mine eyes. So here he changes his tune and is trying to reassure himself that it's just an emotional hallucination. When he talks about bloody business, he always talks about the murder in these sort of euphemistic terms, these terms that make it sound less horrifying than it really is. And it's this informing thus to the mind. It's giving, here it doesn't mean telling, it means taking shape, which gives this thing shape before my eyes. And then his imagery gets darker. Now, over the one half world, nature seems dead. Reflects on the night. And so darkness again, that motif of light and dark, again tells us that we're about to enter a moment where there is a loss of natural order. Half of the world, nature seems dead, not just, an individual. That all of living nature seems as if it's been killed in the dark. And wicked dreams abuse the curtained sleep. It personifies dreams here and shows the loss of its ability to sort of refresh and renew people, which foreshadows his own mental degeneration. And the motif of sleeplessness or tortured sleep continually recurs throughout the play, as does darkness, the motif of light and dark. He then says, witchcraft celebrates pale Hecate's offerings. Pale Hecate is the goddess of the witches. You'll sometimes hear it pronounced Hecate. Hecate is the name of the goddess of the witches. So here, he's aligning himself with evil and the supernatural, like Lady Macbeth does in the previous scenes. She says, come evil spirits, tend on mortal thoughts. She's asking to be sort of guided by them. And then the most complex passage of imagery follows. And withered murder. He imagines murder as an individual here. He kind of personifies the concept itself as this sort of withered, frail, older figure. Alarmed by his sentinel. Sentinel is someone who stands watch over something. So withered murder, called to action by his sort of guard, the wolf, who howls his watch, who howls to call him to murder. Thus, with his stealthily pace. So withered murder moves towards its end with quick, stealthily speed. And so again, the fact that he personifies the murder tells us that he is distancing himself from the action, but that the murder seems to be moving towards its end quickly. And then he says, with Tarquin's ravishing strides. Now, Tarquin is a figure from mythology that raped his friend's wife in the night. Shakespeare himself wrote about this. And this suggests here that the murder of King Duncan that he's planning is almost like a kind of violation in the same way that a rape is. It's an unusual allusion to use here. With ravishing strides towards his design moves like a ghost. And so again, murder is moving towards his plan. But it moves like a ghost. So it's in spirit form, it's stealthily. And so both of these are ways for Macbeth to distance himself from his own evil. If he imagines murder itself as a concept moving towards its goal, it's a way of saying, well, it's not mine. It's just murder itself that's attempting to put this into practice, not me. So you can see from a psychological perspective how uncomfortable he is with this murderous plan. Thou sure and firm set earth, hear not my steps, which way they walk, for fear thy very stones prate of my whereabout. Prate means to kind of blab or to talk loudly about his location. So he addresses here the firm earth and asks it to not make loud noises when he walks, because he needs to move like a ghost, like murder. And so again, he's worried that he can't carry out this plan with the stealthiness that he imagines murder as a person being able to carry the murder out with. He says, and take the present horror from the time, which now suits with it. So the present horror is the silence of the night that he's talking about here, which suits this moment. And this is what he's fearful of, that his steps will be so loud it will ruin the silence, which suits this moment of darkness. Then he says, whilst I threat, he lives. So whilst I'm talking, he's still alive. And whilst I make threats to carry out this plan, he's still alive. And then he says, words to the heat of deeds, too cold breath gives. So here, words only cool the hot deeds of his actions or plans. So while he's talking, he's kind of cooling his heat-oppressed brain, his hot, passionate desire to kill the king. His language, his thinking and thinking it through is cooling down his anxious emotional state. So his speech is putting off the murder and all of the consequences that it entails, that it promises for his soul. Then a bell rings. And this is important because a funeral knell is the bell announcing someone's death. And he seems to interpret the bell this way. This is the moment when he finally decides to actually kill the king. He says, I go and it is done. The bell invites me. So again, he says it's something external to him that's tempting him onwards. He's being called by it. And he repeats this language from Act 1, Scene 7. It is done. Well, of course, it isn't done, but the thinking about it is over. And this is language from the opening of his soliloquy in Act 1, Scene 1. If it were done when it is done, it were well that it were done quickly. And so he keeps repeating this. It shows that he's irritable and anxious, and he wants it to be over. Hear it not, Duncan, for it is a knell, and that is a funeral bell, that summons thee to heaven or to hell. So again, that anxious, ambiguous state of whether the king himself is going to heaven or hell.